John was used to long nights at the office, but that Friday he decided to surprise his wife with flowers. Upon arriving at the company where she worked, her steps became silent when she heard laughter coming from the boss's office. He approached the half-open door and saw him, his wife's boss, shamelessly flirting with her. John's blood ran cold, but he held himself back. She watched from a shadowy corner as her boss made insinuations, touching her arm intimately. That night, when he confronted his wife, she confessed that this was just the tip of the iceberg. Intrigued and filled with cold rage, John began to investigate the company. What he discovered was far worse than he could have imagined, a massive corporate fraud scheme that threatened to destroy lives and careers. John then decided that he would not only avenge the betrayal, but also take down the corrupt empire that hid behind elegant doors and fake smiles. From that moment on, John's life would never be the same. John Thompson was a tall, 35-year-old man with brown hair and piercing blue eyes. I worked as a financial analyst at one of the biggest firms on Wall Street, in New York. His routine was exhausting, but he always found time for his wife, Laura. Laura, in her 30s, was an intelligent and determined woman, working as a project manager at Whitmore Enterprises, a renowned technology company. Their 8-year relationship had always been based on trust and love, but lately John noticed Laura more distant, distracted. Life in New York was intense. The incessant traffic, the lights that never went out, and the fierce competition in the business world kept everyone in a constant state of alert. John and Laura lived in a cozy apartment on the Upper East Side, surrounded by charming cafes and well-kept parks. They loved walking through Central Park on the weekends, a little escape from the hustle and bustle of the city. John's co-workers respected him for his ability to crunch numbers and predict market trends. He was known for his integrity and for never getting involved in shady schemes, something he deeply valued. Laura, on the other hand, was admired for her ability to lead teams and deliver complex projects on time. She had a strong, inspiring presence, which made her a natural leader. Laura's boss, Richard Whitmore, was a charismatic, middle-aged man with a charm that disguised his true intentions well. He had a habit of being overly friendly with his female employees, something John had always found disturbing but had never had any real reason to be suspicious of. Richard had an impeccable reputation in the industry, being frequently cited in business magazines and invited to speak on technological innovation. One morning, John decided to work from home. He took the opportunity to surprise Laura and bring her lunch to the office. Upon arriving at Whitmore Enterprises, a modern, imposing glass and steel building, John was greeted by the receptionist with a polite smile. He walked through the wide, well-decorated hallways until he reached his wife's floor. It was then that he heard the laughter. The sound was coming from Richard's room. John approached and saw, through the crack in the half-open door, Richard leaning over the table, whispering something in Laura's ear. She looked uncomfortable but smiled nervously. John felt a pang of jealousy and distrust. He decided not to enter the room at that moment, but the image remained in his mind. Later that night, after a silent dinner, John confronted Laura. She hesitated, but eventually admitted that Richard often made inappropriate comments and flirted with her. He assured that he had never gone beyond that, but John couldn't get the expression on Richard's face out of his head. He decided he needed to know more about what was happening at the company. John began to investigate. Using his analyst skills, he accessed public financial reports and data he obtained through his industry contacts. Gradually, he began to notice discrepancies in Whitmore Enterprises' balance sheets. Values did not match, and suspicious transactions raised even more doubts. Meanwhile, Laura felt increasingly pressured at work. Richard continued to get closer to her, using his power to manipulate her emotionally. She began to avoid social gatherings and isolate herself more at home. John noticed the growing tension in Laura, which only increased his determination to discover the truth. One day, while reviewing an audit report, John found something that caught his attention. A series of financial transfers to accounts in tax havens. Not only was this illegal, it also indicated a large-scale fraud scheme. He decided he needed concrete evidence before confronting Richard and the company's management. John began to watch Richard closely. I discreetly followed his movements and looked for more evidence. One night, he decided to wait for Richard to leave the office. He followed him to a luxurious restaurant in Manhattan, where Richard met an unknown man. The conversation seemed tense, and John, hiding at a nearby table, managed to hear snippets about keeping it under control and no one can find out. Now, John knew he was dealing with something much bigger than simple flirtations. Richard was involved in a fraud scheme that could destroy the company and affect the lives of many employees, including Laura. Determined to expose the truth, John began documenting every detail, collecting evidence and preparing for the final confrontation. Nights of sleep became rare for John. He spent hours reviewing documents, talking to contacts and planning his next steps. Laura, unaware of the extent of John's investigation, noticed the change in her husband's behavior, but could not fully understand what was happening. The tension between them increased, with secrets and unspoken concerns hanging in the air. The couple's apartment, once a haven of love and tranquility, was now full of shadows and heavy silences. With each passing day, John's resolve grew stronger. Not only did he want justice, but he also needed to protect Laura and ensure Richard paid for his actions. John's introduction to the underworld of corporate corruption was just beginning. He knew that to take down Richard and his schemes, he would need to be cunning and meticulous. The line between justice and revenge became increasingly blurred, and John was willing to cross any line to see Richard Whitmore's downfall. The days following the initial discovery were a whirlwind for John. He knew he needed allies and inside information to pursue his investigation. He decided to approach a former college friend, Marcus, who now worked as a private investigator. Marcus, a cunning man with connections in all the right places, agreed to help John dismantle Richard Whitmore's scheme. Marcus managed to sneak an informant into Whitmore Enterprises, someone who could observe Richard and get information from the inside. This informant, a young analyst named Ethan, was new to the company and had not yet been corrupted by the toxic environment. He was willing to cooperate when Marcus approached him, promising protection and a generous reward. Meanwhile, Laura tried to focus on work, but the tension was palpable. Richard continued to pressure her, and she knew something more sinister was going on behind the scenes. Unbeknownst to John, Laura began keeping copies of suspicious documents, hoping that one day they could be used to unmask Richard. John and Marcus spent nights studying the information Ethan provided. They discovered that Richard's frauds involved falsifying financial records, money laundering and diverting funds to offshore accounts. The magnitude of the scheme was impressive and revealed the true extent of corruption in the company. Each new document reinforced the need to act with precision and discretion. Ethan informed John about secret meetings and compromising conversations. On one of these occasions, Ethan managed to record a heated discussion between Richard and another executive, where they mentioned the risks of being discovered and the need to eliminate any threat. The recording was an important asset, but John knew he needed more proof to guarantee Richard's downfall. The tension increased every day, but John remained cold and calculating. He began planning a way to expose Richard publicly, in a way that would leave no doubt about his guilt. To do this, you would need to gather all the evidence in a robust dossier and find the right moment to make the revelation. Laura, in turn, noticed the change in John's behavior, but didn't understand why. She saw the worry in her husband's eyes and felt guilty that she couldn't fully share what was happening at work. On a particularly difficult night, she decided that she would trust John and tell him about the documents she had been keeping. Upon hearing Laura's revelation, John realized they were closer than ever to taking Richard down. Combining Ethan's information with Laura's documents, they began to build an irrefutable case. However, they knew that Richard would not give up easily and that any misstep could put everyone in danger. John and Marcus planned a coordinated attack. Marcus would get an audience with a renowned journalist, someone who had the courage and resources to publish the story without fear of reprisal. At the same time, John would prepare the presentation of the evidence, ensuring that everything was meticulously organized and impossible to refute. On a cold autumn morning, Marcus finally managed to meet with journalist, Jennifer Collins, known for her investigative reporting and exposing corruption in high places. Jennifer listened carefully to John and Marcus' story, and upon seeing the evidence, agreed to take the case forward. She knew it would be an explosive report, capable of shaking the foundations of Whitmore Enterprises and Richard's reputation. With everything prepared, John knew the next step was the most dangerous. Richard began to become suspicious of the movements and reinforced security around him. John and Marcus decided to act quickly to prevent Richard from destroying evidence or escaping. Jennifer was ready to publish the story, but she needed John's signal to launch the media bomb. That night, John, Marcus, and Jennifer gathered for one last adjustment to the plan. They knew that once the story was published, there would be no going back. John was determined to see Richard pay for all his crimes, but he also knew the consequences would be profound and permanent. While Laura tried to maintain normality at work, John waited for the right moment to act. Finally, the time has come. With all the pieces in place, Jennifer published the report, a detailed and shocking expose of Richard Whitmore's fraud. The news spread like wildfire, and the public reaction was immediate. Richard, upon learning of the publication, desperately tried to control the damage. But the evidence was irrefutable. Authorities began to investigate, and Richard's downfall seemed inevitable. John felt a mix of relief and adrenaline. I knew the battle was far from over, but the first big step had been taken. With Richard's public exposure, Whitmore Enterprises collapsed. Employees began to be interrogated, and those involved in the scheme tried to save their own skins. John watched closely, knowing that true justice was yet to come. He was prepared to face whatever challenge came next, determined to see Richard's complete downfall and complete revenge for everything that had happened. The morning after Jennifer Collins' report was published was chaotic. News of Richard Whitmore's fraud scheme dominated every media channel. Images of Richard hurriedly leaving his mansion, surrounded by lawyers and security guards, were repeated over and over again. New York City was in an uproar, and Whitmore Enterprises was the epicenter of the scandal. John watched everything from home, with a mixture of satisfaction and anxiety. He knew that Richard would try to fight the charges, and that the legal battle would be long and complex. But he was confident in the evidence he had gathered with the help of Laura, Ethan, and Marcus. Meanwhile, Laura was in the office, witnessing the chaos unfolding around her. Co-workers were questioned, and the tension was palpable. Richard, in an act of desperation, called an emergency meeting of the company's top executives. The conference room was crowded, and the atmosphere was tense. Richard, with his face closed and his eyes red from anger and lack of sleep, began to speak. "You all know why we are here. This report is a hoax, a desperate attempt to destroy our company. We need to come together and find a way to reverse this situation," said Richard, trying to keep his voice steady. But the looks around the table were of doubt and fear. Many of the executives knew the accusations were well-founded, and were more concerned with saving their own careers than defending Richard. The tension increased when Ethan, infiltrating the meeting, asked a question. "Richard, how can we be sure there is no more evidence against us?" asked Ethan, with a worried expression. Richard shot Ethan a withering look, but responded with a controlled tone. "I have already taken steps to ensure that all relevant evidence is destroyed. Trust me, we'll get out of this." As the meeting continued, John and Marcus prepared for the next step. They knew that Richard would try to manipulate the situation in his favor and that they would need a final blow to ensure he didn't get away with it. They decided it was time to confront Richard directly. That afternoon, John received a call from Ethan. Richard was organizing a document burning in an abandoned warehouse on the outskirts of New York. It was the perfect chance to catch Richard in the act. John and Marcus hurried to get to the scene, taking cameras and equipment with them to record everything. When they arrived at the warehouse, they saw Richard and some of his henchmen burning piles of documents in large metal bins. John felt his adrenaline rising. It was now or never. He and Marcus approached silently, positioning cameras to capture their every movement. Richard was visibly nervous, and his voice was shaking as he gave orders to the men. "We need to get rid of all this before the police arrive. We cannot leave traces." John felt the urge to confront Richard right then and there, but Marcus grabbed his arm, signaling him to wait. They needed the visual evidence to ensure Richard had no way to defend himself. Finally, John and Marcus revealed themselves, pointing the cameras at Richard and his men. The surprise and panic were instantaneous. Richard tried to react, but John was quick. "Richard, your time is up. We have everything recorded. There's no escape anymore," John said, with frightening calm. Richard looked at John with a mixture of hatred and despair. "You don't know who you're dealing with, John. It will destroy you too." But John was not intimidated. He knew he was in control now. "It's a risk I'm willing to take. Now, surrender." Richard had no choice but to surrender. The police arrived soon after, alerted by Marcus, and arrested Richard and his henchmen. The evidence collected in the warehouse, along with the information already disclosed by Jennifer, was more than enough to guarantee a conviction. Over the next few days, John felt a mixture of relief and exhaustion. He knew that the legal battle would still take time, but he was certain that Richard would face the consequences of his actions. Laura could finally breathe a sigh of relief. Tension in the office eased as Whitmore Enterprises tried to get back on its feet under new management. John and Laura decided to take a few days off, away from the city, to recover from all the stress. They rented a small cabin in the mountains, where they spent hours talking, reflecting on everything that had happened. For John, revenge tasted bittersweet. He had achieved his goal, but he knew the emotional scars would remain for a long time. Meanwhile, Jennifer continued her investigation, delving deeper into the ramifications of the fraud scheme and the web of corruption that Richard had created. His series of reports exposed not only Richard but also other executives who had participated in the scheme, leading to a series of arrests and firings at Whitmore Enterprises. As time passed, the company began to recover. New transparency and ethics policies were implemented, and the employees who remained felt a renewed sense of purpose. Laura was promoted to a leadership position, recognized for her integrity and dedication, and began working to restore trust in the company. John, in turn, found a new passion in writing. Inspired by the experience of exposing Richard, he began writing a book about corruption in the corporate world. His narrative was not just a personal vendetta, but a warning to everyone about the dangers of greed and lack of ethics. Months later, during the launch of his book, John received an unexpected call from Jennifer. She had discovered new documents that revealed the full extent of Richard's crimes, including a list of accomplices who were still at large. John knew that the fight against corruption was ongoing and that he had a role to play in exposing these injustices. From that moment on, John and Jennifer formed an unbeatable partnership. Together, they continued to investigate and expose corruption schemes, dedicating themselves to making a difference in the corporate world. Laura, always by John's side, supported his mission, knowing that the fight for justice was a legacy worth leaving. While looking out over New York City from the top of a skyscraper, John felt a sense of peace. He had faced his demons and won. But he knew that the real victory was the continuous search for a fairer and more transparent world. And on this mission, he would never be alone. The days following Richard Whitmore's arrest were intense for John and Laura. While the media covered the case extensively, revealing more details about the extent of the fraud, Whitmore Enterprises struggled to weather the storm. Laura, now in a leadership position, was dedicated to rebuilding trust with investors and employees. Her strength and determination were admired by everyone, and she became a symbol of resilience in the midst of chaos. John, on the other hand, focused on his new mission alongside Jennifer. Their partnership bore fruit, and new investigations began to reveal even more corruption schemes in other companies. John felt like he was finally making a difference in a way he had never imagined before. But despite his success, there was an underlying tension in his mind. The feeling that the fight was far from over kept him alert. One afternoon, while John was reviewing documents in his office, he received a call from Marcus. There were new developments in the Whitmore case. Additional documents had been found, detailing secret accounts and fund transfers that had not previously been revealed. John knew that this new information could be the final piece in ensuring that Richard and his accomplices paid in full for their crimes. "John, we need to act quickly. These documents are explosive. They connect Richard to other executives and show a level of corruption even greater than we thought," Marcus said, with an urgency in his voice that John recognized well. "Let's do this. Contact Jennifer and arrange a meeting." "We need to make sure everything is disclosed properly," replied John, feeling his adrenaline rising again. Meanwhile, Laura faced challenges of her own. The company was still in crisis, and meetings with investors were tense. She knew that to save Whitmore Enterprises, she would need to implement profound changes and regain everyone's trust. His team, inspired by his leadership, worked tirelessly alongside him. The next day, John, Marcus and Jennifer met at a low-key cafe in downtown New York. Jennifer, always focused and determined, listened carefully to the new discoveries. They laid out a detailed plan to release the information and ensure justice was served. "We need to ensure that these documents are seen by the public and authorities. They are the final proof that Richard and his accomplices cannot escape," said Jennifer, with the determination that had made her a renowned journalist. "I agree. But we need to be careful. Richard still has powerful allies, and any mistake could jeopardize everything," replied John, aware of the risks. With the plan in action, Jennifer prepared a new report, this time more comprehensive and devastating. The publication made an immediate impact. Public opinion, already outraged by previous scandals, now demanded a quick response from the authorities. Additional investigations were launched, and the network of accomplices began to be dismantled. Meanwhile, at Whitmore Enterprises, Laura was leading a series of internal renovations. He implemented new transparency and ethics policies, and began to rebuild the company's structure. His firm and visionary leadership won the support of employees and investors, and little by little, the company began to recover. At home, John and Laura found comfort in each other. The nights were a time to reflect on everything they had been through and to support each other. They knew the battle was far from over, but they were more united than ever. One night, as they walked through Central Park, John held Laura's hand and said, "We've been through so much, but we're stronger. I know we still have challenges ahead, but with you by my side, I feel like we can face anything." Laura smiled, feeling the sincerity in John's words. "We will always be together, John. And I know we will make a difference, no matter what." Their determination was palpable, and they knew that the future held even more challenges and opportunities. But for now, they were ready to face whatever came, together and stronger than ever. The months that followed were crucial for everyone involved. With Jennifer Collins' new report, the siege has definitively closed on Richard Whitmore and his accomplices. The trial became a media spectacle, following every detail of the explosive revelations about the fraud scheme. Richard, once a titan of industry, now faced a series of charges that promised decades in prison. During the trial, the evidence presented by John, Laura, and the documents obtained by Ethan was damning. Richard tried to defend himself, claiming innocence and conspiracy, but the avalanche of evidence was overwhelming. When Ethan took the witness stand, his detailed testimony sealed Richard's fate. The sentencing was swift and harsh, with Richard being sentenced to a long term in federal prison. The end of their era of corruption and manipulation had irrefutably arrived. As Richard faced his fate, Whitmore Enterprises struggled to get back on its feet. Under Laura's leadership, the company began to show signs of recovery. But the path was long and full of obstacles. Laura, even after being promoted and respected for her integrity, faced the harsh reality of rebuilding trust in a ruthless market. On a Friday night, after an exhausting week of work, Laura was surprised in her office by an unexpected visitor. One of the company's former executives, involved in the fraud scheme, had managed to escape initial investigations. Now, desperate and vengeful, he sought out Laura, believing that she was responsible for his downfall. "You ruined my life, Laura," he shouted, abruptly entering the room. "I'll make sure you pay for this." Laura, despite the fear she felt, remained firm. He remembered all the support he received from John and the mission they both embraced. When the man advanced towards her, security guards, alerted by the commotion, quickly intervened, immobilizing the attacker. He was arrested, and the attempt at revenge only strengthened Laura's determination to continue her fight for justice and transparency. John, in turn, became a successful author and speaker, traveling the country to speak about business ethics and the importance of integrity. His talks were inspiring, and he often cited his own experience as an example of how truth and justice always prevail, even in the face of adversity. During one of these trips, John received an urgent call from Marcus. One of Richard's accomplices, who was still at large, had been located. It was an opportunity to close another chapter in this complex corruption story. John, Marcus, and Jennifer met again to plan their next move. Capturing this accomplice could finally bring peace to everyone affected by Richard's scheme. The operation was precise and effective. With the help of authorities, the accomplice was captured and confessed to his participation in the scheme, revealing additional details that helped to completely clear the name of Whitmore Enterprises and all the innocent people who were harmed. In the months that followed, life began to return to normal for John and Laura. They knew that the fight for justice was never over, but they were ready to face any challenge that came their way. The experience had strengthened and united them in ways they never imagined. One night, as they walked through Central Park, reliving memories of simpler times, John stopped and looked deeply into Laura's eyes. "We went through so much, but we did it. And I know that no matter what happens, we will always be together." Laura smiled, feeling the truth in his words. "Yes, John. Always together, facing whatever comes." They hugged each other, feeling the weight of past struggles and the lightness of a promising future. Their fight had brought justice, revealed painful truths, but also created new hope. And as they walked home, they knew that true victory lay in their unwavering unity and determination. And so, the story of love, betrayal and cold revenge came to an end. But for John and Laura, it was just the beginning of a new journey, where truth and justice would always be their guides.